So that was all news to me. I had no idea that I was going to pop up on there, but thank you, Kyle, for that. All right. So I want to start this morning by asking you a question. How many of you, especially those of you that have had kids or raised a family, or even if you've had an influence on some child's life, how many of you have ever made a comment similar to this? I will never raise my kids the way my parents raised me. Anybody say something similar to that? All right. Well, it's kind of funny because often what we find is as we go through our lives, we find that we do, in fact, end up doing a lot of things in parenting the way our family or our parents parented us, right? And that's for better or for worse in some situations, but it's always interesting at how many times I end up saying something and I'm like, oh my gosh, my dad just spoke through my mouth, or my mom did this or that thing. And so, friends, one of the reasons for that is because obviously we learn how to be parents and raise a family from our parents, right? They're the ones that teach us and model for us what marriage and family should look like. And so I thought it only appropriate that we spend some time looking at some of the things that I think make for strong and healthy families. And over the course of the next 3 weeks, we're going to be looking at various aspects of a healthy family. And so this week we're going to be talking about the role of marriage. Next week we're going to talk about the kids' favorite topic, which is discipline. And then in week 3, Kyle is going to come up and he's going to share a message with you on what happens when family life doesn't look the way that we think it should, or what happens when challenges arise in family matters. And so I want us to just be prayerful about that as we go through. Now, as we start this morning, one of the things that I did is I took some time to think about what are some of the aspects that make for a healthy family, okay? And let's just briefly go through those. So one of the things that if we look at healthy families, many of these tend to have a healthy structure and a healthy amount of discipline in there, okay? And so on the one hand, the structure creates a sense of security, that there are certain things that are in place in a child's day that they can rely upon, but are not so burdensome that they get anxious about all of the things they have to do, okay? And so I can tell you from experience, Sarah and I did foster care before we even had children of our own, and we ended up just diving right in the deep end because the social workers gave us a couple of teens to start off with, which was pretty eye-opening. And so one of the things that we had to deal with was to try to figure out how we create healthy structure and healthy discipline for a set of kids who did not have that earlier in their life. And boy, let me tell you, there was times that was a struggle. And yet, many times that we have seen them since then, they have kind of affirmed that, well, we maybe didn't do everything right. They were thankful for the fact that we showed them or modeled for them what healthy structure and discipline can look like. The second one is this idea that parents and grandparents need to discover and facilitate the kids' interests, okay? And so one of the things that parents need to be paid close attention to is, just as I kind of alluded to in that introductory question for you all, is that sometimes we can begin to move our children down a path that makes them follow the things that we're interested in, right? And we can almost begin to live vicariously through our kids, and we say, well, you know what, I never had the opportunity to do this and this when I'm a kid, and I'm going to make sure my kid has every opportunity to do this and this and this. And what can happen is that the child can become resentful because it's all about what the parent wants and not some of the things that they really enjoy. And so healthy families take the time to discover what their kids' gifts and skill sets are. And guess what? Each and every one of them is going to have their own things. And so it's important that you take that time, but that you also nurture them to be willing and feel confident to go out and to use those. Another thing that parents can often succumb to is what I call FOMO, right? This fear of missing out. And as parents, we deal with this all of the time. Even right now, I spend a lot of time doing some personal investing. And one of the big things right now is this fear of missing out in the market, because the market does nothing but go straight up every day. And people are just throwing a bunch of money in because they don't want to miss out, rather than taking the time to say, well, is this really the best investment? Is this really the best place to put my resources? And so one of the things that families do is that they learn to prioritize healthy relationships. And so they say, you know what? My kid doesn't need to be in 6 different sports a year from the time that he's in 4K till the time that he graduates high school. Okay? Rather, they'll probably say, I think it's important that kids learn teamwork, or that kids go and utilize some of the gifts they have in an extracurricular activity, but they don't need to be in every single one. And they also are good at saying, you know what, we need to create some experiences within the family that bring our family together and help grow and nurture those relationships. Okay, and so it's important that we feed and invest in those healthy relationships, sometimes at the expense of the child doing 100 different things simply because they want to or feel like they have to do it. Finally, one of the key components in a successful family is marriage. And, this is an area that we have not talked a lot about. In fact, I would say it's been divorced from this idea of parenting, because quite honestly, when we think about marriage, there's many of us that have missed the mark, right? We live in a world where the divorce rate, at least in the secular world, is close to 50%. Even within the church, estimates range from 30 to 40%. And so when we look at this idea of having a healthy marriage and be able to raise kids, oftentimes we want to just skip over that and say, well, families just do the best that they can, and we're just going to focus on different ways that we can parent kids. But friends, as I alluded to earlier, kids learn what marriage looks like, and they learn how to live in a family through parents. And again, I understand that it's difficult for many of us, but we're going to go through and we're going to talk about some different aspects of marriage this morning. Now, as Christians, many of us have what I would consider to be a healthy vision of what we think marriage should look like, right? And many of us believe in the importance of a couple coming and staying together, and you make that vow till death do you part, and you're willing to do whatever it takes to stay together. But as I said, life isn't always that easy. And even as we go back and we look at the scriptures, we find that there aren't a whole bunch of positive examples of healthy family in Scripture, right? I mean, if you look at the first family, Adam and Eve, the first couple to get married, and what do? They go and bring sin into the world and ruin it for the rest of us. One of their sons, not long after that, goes and murders his brother because he's upset that his offering isn't as accepted by God as that. And so, friends, time and time again, as we look at Scripture, we find that really the biblical example of family is ugly and it's dysfunctional. Okay? And so one of the things we need to do then is to begin to look at what God says and what is this ideal, or what is the vision that God has for this. Now, there's always a couple of jokes I like to tell, because we can always say, well, there's not a lot of good examples of family or strong marriage in the Old Testament maybe, but what about Jesus? Jesus' family had to be pretty good. But I'm just thinking, friends, can you imagine what it would be like to be Jesus' brother or sister? The fact that he never does anything wrong. Well, Jesus never gave me any flack about eating his vegetables, or Jesus never would talk back to his mother the way you just talked back to me. Or, sometimes I like to think Jesus was a little strong-willed on his own. And so sometimes, maybe it wasn't quite all that easy for Mary herself to do some things, okay? But again, friends, one of the things that we need to go through is to figure out and begin to look at God's vision for marriage. And so if we go way back to the creation story in verse 2 of Genesis, we see God's vision for what marriage should look like. And this is Adam speaking in verse 23. He says, "Then man said, this at last is bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman, for out of man this one was taken. Therefore a man leaves his father and his mother and clings to his wife, and they become one flesh." And so, friends, here's the vision. Here's the godly vision of what marriage looks like. And I always am so amazed that it happens right at the beginning of the creation story. Right? As soon as woman is made, the vision for what God thinks marriage should look like is put into place. Now, that word clings in verse 24 is a very important word because it almost means to be cemented together, right? That the husband and wife become locked together and that nothing should really be able to pull them apart. And so think about the strength then and the foundation that provides for us to begin to move forward as we look at some of these further things. But now, as I said, one of the things that we have to contend with is we have God's vision of marriage, this perfect union between man and wife, and yet we have to live in reality. The fact that it doesn't matter if we've been married 1 year or 60 years, the fact is many of us, or all of us for that matter, have failed to live up to God's ideal of marriage, right? We all make mistakes along the way. We have all done things that have not honored or loved our spouse or partner. And so we have to figure out then, how do we move into this ideal while also living within it, okay? And what happens often, as we can see in the world around us, is that as marriages fall apart, there becomes more and more problems for family. And oftentimes, it's the kids and women who become the victims and have the hardest role or road to play in those broken relationships. Now, as we look for it, again, the thing I love about Scripture is that it just basically assumes that we're not going to get things all right? Because otherwise, if we were going to get things right, Jesus had no purpose in coming down to be an atoning sacrifice for each of us. And so as we look at Jesus's life, we find that he's really the one that helps us navigate this ideal from what's real, okay? And so Jesus's ministry was all centered on what I call the kingdom idea, this invitation to live into the kingdom of God. And many times throughout scriptures, especially in the Gospels, we find that Jesus always says, "You have heard it said this, but I tell you this thing." And so what he's saying is, look, here's the rule that you've been given, and this is kind of is what life is supposed to look like, but here's the ideal. This is what it really looks like in God's kingdom. And so to use an example that pertains to marriage a little bit, it'll say, guess what? You have heard it said that you shall not commit adultery. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Okay? So what we see him do is says, here's the rule, here's the commandment that Moses gave you, you shall not commit adultery. And there's some of you who like to think you live that commandment out to the letter of the law, but guess what? In God's kingdom, it's bigger than that. And it's not just about not having sex with some other person's wife or husband, but it's the fact that if you look at another person lustfully, you've committed adultery in your heart. All right? And why does he do that, friends? Because think of how ugly marriages and relationships look is that every time someone of the opposite sex walks by us, we're sitting there gawking and thinking lustfully about that person. How many of our relationships are going to last if that's our attitude? Well, I didn't have sex with anybody else, but that doesn't mean that my mind and thoughts were where they should be, right? So Jesus gives us this ideal, and he continues to show us what it's like when we're real. And so later in the gospel, we see a prime example of someone who's caught in adultery, right? This lady gets caught in adultery. Now, again, I always tell you, I can't figure out why they caught her and not the man. I mean, if they're caught in the act, you'd think you would have caught both of them. But Anyway, the woman gets drug out here and gets placed before Jesus. And what is Jesus's response? He moves immediately to the ideal, right? He says, "Let those of you who have no sin cast the first stone," right? And so what does that do? It makes those guys go, well, the law tells us that if someone's caught in adultery, we have the right to stone them, to put them to death. But Jesus moves them back to the ideal and says, look, are any of you guys without sin? And isn't the punishment for sin always death? And so they back off. And then what is Jesus' response to this woman? Does he just sit there and wag his finger at her and tell her how terrible she is? No. He says, look, woman, where are your condemners? I forgive you. Go and sin no more. Okay, so he doesn't just say, oh, well, there you go. You're free to go and live your life as you want. Take care. No, he says, go and sin no more. Look, you know the rule. Here's the thing. You're to be faithful to your husband. Don't sin anymore and go and live. And so Jesus was this master of living and showing us how to operate in that tension of the real and the ideal. Now, I want to take a moment, too, because this also, this next concept continues to move us to sort of this idea of extremes, right? And part of this is the, again, what I'll call the tension or the coupling of grace and truth, okay? Now, many of us can look around the world today and say, it just seems like we live in a world of extremes, right? There's all of these loud voices on each end of whatever spectrum you want to look at, and they tend to be the loudest. But most of us, I think, if we have any common sense, realize that no one can really, that the extremes are just kind of ridiculous, right? That really the place to be is sort of in this center, all right, this place. But oftentimes that's difficult. And so even as we deal with things like issues or concepts of grace and truth, we find that it can be difficult, right? So someone who says, you know what, truth is the most important thing that there is, can oftentimes become judgmental or dogmatic or hypocritical, right? So if you're constantly waving your finger at someone saying, well, look, this is the truth, and what you're doing or how you feel doesn't really matter, and you just sit there and wag your finger, well, guess what? It doesn't take real long for someone to look and find a flaw in your life and say, oh, well, he's over here preaching this, and yet look at all the things that he's doing wrong in his life. Now, on the opposite side, you know, we know that God is also a God of grace, but grace doesn't mean that God just allows you to go and do anything you want to do because you want to do it, right? Our God is a loving and a forgiving God, a God who loves unconditionally, but guess what? Love has restrictions. Love has responsibilities. It's love that allows Jesus to forgive that woman that comes to adultery, and it's also love that says, you know what? I desire so much more for you, and you need to go and do things differently. Go and sin no more. So the writer of the Gospel of John tells us that the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. For the law was given through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. You guys want to move me one? All right. Oop. And so one of the things that, again, we see Jesus talk about is the importance of marriage, okay? And in chapter 19 of Matthew, we see Jesus engage with some religious leaders on the concept of divorce. And they come to him and they say, you know what, Jesus, you know, is it true that a person, as a man, should be able to divorce his wife for any reason whatsoever? And Jesus says, no, that's not really the vision that God had for marriage, okay? And then he says, you know, in fact, unless there's clear evidence of sexual immorality, there should be no divorce whatsoever. And the religious leaders really kind of get hung up on this, and they get mad, and it says, well, Moses allowed us to give a certificate of divorce. But again, Jesus says, look, yes, Moses gave that to you because you guys are sinful and you can't live up to this, but this is really what you're supposed to live to. You make a commitment, or at least in modern times, the language we use is till death do us part, right? And if many of us think about the severity or the heaviness of that covenant commitment that we make, it's not something that we should just be willing to throw away or break lightly. And then, so the religious leaders get mad because Jesus speaks truthfully. He just lays it down and says, look, this is the vision. Here's the truth. And if you guys don't like it, that's too bad. But this is what God has in store for marriage. And what do Jesus' own disciples do? Oh my gosh, God, if that's really what marriage is, then it's better not even to get married at all. Right? And so they were used to, again, siding with these religious leaders that a man could divorce his wife just simply because he didn't bend the knee to everything that he wanted done. If she burned his food, guess what? That's reason for divorce. And so these guys struggle with that, and yet he says, look, I get that you guys struggle with it. I get that sometimes relationships are really, really hard. But here's the ideal, and we need to move through it. Now, friends, I want us to go back to the role that marriage plays on the family, and we're going to move through some of this really quickly. But friends, it's important to understand that a healthy marriage is so impactful, so profound on a child because they watch and they learn everything. And whether they're going to learn what a healthy marriage looks like for themselves, or they're going to look at healthy parenting techniques, guess what? It comes from the modeling they see in a marriage. And so here I have a verse of Cats in the Cradle by Mr. Chapman. And it says, my child arrived just the other day. He came into the world in the usual way, but there were planes to catch and bills to pay. He learned to walk while I was away. And he was talking for I knew it. And as he grew, he said, I'm going to be like you, Dad. I'm going to be like you. And so, friends, again, it's scary to think of the responsibility that we have as parents. And sometimes we take for granted how much these little creatures watch and pay attention to everything that we do. Okay? And I want to share a story with you because I was almost knocked off my feet one day because all of a sudden my oldest son comes up to me and he says, gosh, Dad, are you and Mom going to get a divorce? And I'm like, where in the world did that statement come from? Because I never had even thought that that was a worry for him. And yet what I realize is that, he's now in school and he's interacting with kids whose families are broken. Moms and dads live in different houses. Some parents are raised by only one parent. Some people are doing the really hard work of trying to blend different families together. And so what happened was he began to see Sarah and I argue a little bit, and he got really insecure and said, are you guys going to split up? Are you guys going to get divorced? And it was like, holy cow, I didn't even know that you were paying attention to that. Now, as just a little side tangent, I think it's important, honestly, for kids to see some level of conflict within a marriage, right? Because, again, how are they going to learn how to be healthy in navigating and resolving that conflict if they never see it done? There are some people who say, never argue in front of your kids. Well, how are they ever going to know and learn how to resolve conflict with their spouse when it comes? Now, on the other hand, I'm not saying that when the crap hits the fan and you and your spouse are going all out on each other, that the kids need to be present and hear all of that stuff, right? So again, there needs to be healthy boundaries in place. But even some of the things that we think are ugly in relationships need to be modeled in a healthy way for our kids, because quite honestly, as just about any parent will tell you, it feels like some days there are those days that never end, but that yet then you blink and all of a sudden they're just about out of the house. And you're like, where in the world did that time go? And so, friends, again, we need to understand how important it is to model healthy behavior, especially in terms of marriage, because hopefully the goal is that one day our kids will get married and they need to know what to do. So let me give you a couple of practical tips this morning. The first one is that you need to prioritize your marriage, okay? And that means prioritizing your marriage above your children, all right? And some people really struggle with that, all right? But I kind of operate out of this, what I'll call this conservative understanding of priority, and that is that you need to take care of yourself, okay? And if you can't take care of yourself, you're going to struggle to take care of someone else, your spouse, all right? And then your spouse and you need to be healthy. You need to have a healthy marriage because, as I said, if you guys are unhealthy, it's going to impact your kids. And so you need to prioritize your relationship with each other and invest in that relationship, even at the expense of your kids sometimes. Because as much as we love our kids don't always need to be the center of the universe. And they need to learn sometimes that they too have an important role to play. And sometimes that's just to give mom and dad space. The second thing is we need to have open and flowing communication. All right. Anybody who says anything about relationships says, guess what? You got to learn to communicate. Well, friends, sometimes communication gets really hard during parenting. Everybody's trying to do all of their stuff, and pretty soon it can feel like you're like two ships passing in the night, and you happen to say, hey, hope you have a good day, and oh, good night, I love you. And that can be the extent of communication. Well, when that happens, friends, guess what? The relationship begins to break down. And you need to remember that you're modeling for your kids. Because one day they may have a spouse that they need to communicate with, and if they never saw you do it, how are they going to ever learn how to communicate? Because chances are they're going to do the same things we do. And then finally, friends, find time to be together, okay? And whether that means, especially for those of you in the young years of your parenting, it may mean that you have to burn the candle a little bit more in the evening and stay up once your kids are in bed, or it may mean you have to get up extra early in the morning so you can create that time for your family, all right? The next thing I would say is that you need to have consistent date time. You need to date each other, engage each other in a meaningful way. And then you also need that special time to be intimate with each other. Okay? And so, friends, I will leave you with that this morning. The action steps are pretty much what I just talked about, but I really encourage you this week to pray for each other. Journal and vision what your marriage could look like in the next 6 months and begin to pursue that. Go on a date, and then find time to be intimate with each other. All right, you guys, God bless.